Hello, everyone. It's Pastor Sarah Stobie from Bayshore Lutheran Church, and this is Biblical Lit Week 13. Wow, here we are. And as I said last week, which was more about an overview and about the ark and less about an individual story, we are in the midst of 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel, which reads, as I told you, like a complicated A Day in Our Lives of Israel. It really is a soap opera, and it's hard for me as I'm reading through this with you to pinpoint just one or two things. As you're reading week 13, you're going to see that theme of the ark come through. I kind of gave you a heads up last week talking about the importance of the ark and why the ark was so important to the people of Israel. You're going to read how David brings the ark back into Jerusalem, and you're going to see how he handles himself doing that. Again, I'm not going to ruin the story for you on that. Today, what I want to talk about is not Bathsheba. Okay, we're not going to go through that story. I know that we've gone through that before, either in Bible study or in sermons and homilies and whatnot over the years. What I would like to do is focus on one of the reasons why God loved David. Now, this is just one of the reasons. David had a heart for God, and God loved David's heart. You'll see and read that in scriptures of 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel. And David messes up terribly. David does some big sins. David makes a lot of mistakes along the way. And some of you may be even thinking, wow, why does the Lord love David so much? Well, I'm going to focus on that today. We're going to look at 2 Samuel chapter 3. And we're actually going to go through it so you can just follow along and listen with me. So 2 Samuel chapter 3 is all about David accepting Abner. Now, who is Abner? Abner was a general, if you will, for Saul. He worked hard for Saul. And remember, David loved Saul. And remember, David mourned Saul and Jonathan and realized that Saul had to no longer be king so he could step into that role. But how Saul died and everything like that, it bothered David. It bothered him. He was not a callous leader. And so here is Abner. Abner is now serving Saul's son, and David is establishing himself, and Abner is working really hard with the family of the house of Saul, as our Bible puts it. And chapter 3 begins that there was a long war between the house of Saul and the house of David. David grew stronger and stronger, while the house of Saul became weaker and weaker. And Abner saw that. Abner knew that he was on the losing team, if you will. But I do think Abner would have kept serving the house of Saul, except Saul's son accuses Abner of a grave sin. What happens here, and you'll see it in verse 7, it says, "Now Saul had a concubine whose name was Rizpah, daughter of Aiah. And Ishmael said to Abner, 'Why have you gone into my father's concubine?'" Now, this was an accusation. Abner is deeply offended. Abner is deeply offended. These words, the Bible says, makes Abner very angry. And he says, "Am I a dog's head for Judah?" I mean, this is just a rhetorical question, obviously. But basically, he's saying, are you insulting me? Today, I keep showing loyalty to the house of your father Saul, to his brothers and to his friends. And have I not given you into the hand of David? And yet you charge me now with a crime concerning this woman? So may God do to Abner, and so may he add to it. For just what the Lord has sworn to David, that will I accomplish for him, to transfer the kingdom for the house of Saul and set up a throne of David over Israel and over Judah, from Dan to Beersheba. Okay? So he's gravely insulted. He's insulted that Saul's son has accused him of having a relationship with Saul's own concubine, which was against the law. That could not have happened. And it was a terrible accusation back then. And Abner realizes, I'm on the losing team here. So what does he do? Abner reaches out to David. And Abner reaches out to David saying, make your covenant with me, and I will give you my support to bring all Israel over to you. And David said, good, I will make a covenant with you. But then David does something. You see, 8 years ago, yes, 8 years ago, David's wife left him. His first wife, which was the daughter of Saul, Michal, left David, okay? And David has not gotten over this sting. David, I don't know if he loved her or not, probably was more about pride and possession, but David's still upset. 8 years. In fact, not only did Michal leave, but then Saul gave her away to another man to be married to. So she's now been with someone at least 7 years and probably has had children and probably loves her husband at this point. But David said, you know what, Abner? This covenant between us, it can't happen until I have Saul's daughter, Michal, my wife, back. So David sends those messengers to Saul's son and says, give me my wife Michal, to whom I became engaged at the price of 100 foreskins of the Philistines. And guess what? He did. Saul's son and brother to Michal sends her back to David. And the bad thing is she literally is taken forcibly away from her husband, Paltiel, and she is taken now to David. And Paltiel, her husband, is crying and weeping. He does not want his wife to go. There's no mention of children here at all. But Abner says, just leave. Go back home is what the Bible says. And so the husband, he does. Now, according to law, he probably wasn't married properly to Michal. But I think we're slicing some hairs here. David obviously wanted her back as a sign and seal of his connection to Saul, which was what his original intent was when he married her. And so now that Abner is coming to David and being with David, now David wants Michal back as well. And so that's what happens. So Abner, Michal, they all come back into David's house. And verse 20 tells us Abner came not only with himself, but 20 men to David at Hebron. David made a feast for Abner and the men who were with him. Abner said to David, let me go and rally all Israel to my lord the king, in order that they may make a covenant with you, and that you may reign over all that your heart desires. So David dismissed Abner, and he went away in peace. Now this sounds good. Except obviously there's more to the story, because as we continue on in chapter 3, we find out that Joab, who is David's nephew and who has also been a general, if you will, in David's army, he finds out that Abner was dismissed from David and he's still alive. And you got to remember, Joab and Abner, they fought each other, right? They had a contentious relationship. One followed one king, one followed the other. And so it was not good, right? Well, Joab is angry, very angry. And he says to David, he says, what have you done? Abner came to you. Why did you dismiss him so that he got away? You know that Abner, son of Ner, came to deceive you and to learn your coming and going and to learn all that you're doing. And when Joab came out from David's presence, he sent messengers after Abner, and they brought him back from the cistern of Sirah, but David did not know it. And when Abner returned to Hebron, Joab took him aside in the gateway to speak with him privately, and there Joab stabbed him in the stomach. All this happens without David's knowing. Joab does all this without David's knowing. And when David hears about it, and yes, Joab's mad because Abner killed Joab's brother. Yes. But when David hears this, David is upset and says, "May the guilt fall on the head of Joab and on all his father's house, and may the house of Joab never be without one who has a discharge, or who is leprous, or who holds a spindle, or who falls by the sword, or who lacks food." That's an insult. But basically what David is saying is, Joab was in the wrong. I left Abner in peace. We had a covenant. And Joab did not honor my covenant with Abner. Joab, out of anger for his own flesh and blood being killed by Abner, stabs Abner. Abner had no idea this was going to happen. Abner didn't know that Joab was going to do this. David didn't know it, and David was upset. I think, again, this is another reason why his heart is something that the Lord loves, because the Lord realized that this was not David's doing. This was not David's sin that he was carrying. This was an act of anger and violence from Joab. And David's word was meant to be followed, and it wasn't followed here. And so David calls for a time of mourning. They bury Abner of Hebron, and then the king, it says here, lifts up his voice and wept at the grave of Abner, and all the people wept with him. The king lamented for Abner, saying, "Should Abner die as a fool dies? Your hands were not bound, your feet were not fettered. As one falls before the wicked, you have fallen." And basically, David mourns. And everyone knew from the way that David was mourning that he had nothing to do with Abner's death. Nothing to do with Abner's death. And the people of God loved David even more for that. Because again, David's word of peace was meant to be followed. It was not followed. It was not followed not because of something David did, but because of something someone else did. So I do think that this is one of those reasons why God does love and favor David, because deep down, David is trying to do the right thing. He's trying to be the best king that he can be. And I don't mind telling you, it's going to get worse here, as we've talked about. You know, the whole thing about David and how he handles Uriah and how he handles Bathsheba. I mean, it's all coming soon. And then what we will also see is how David's house, even though he has attempted to be the best king he can be, some of his decisions have repercussions in his children, and how his children then act out following their upbringing under David and some of the decisions that they make, and especially his son Absalom. It's sad. And in a way, I feel that we can connect to David, because sometimes we can be and try to be the very best person that we can, and we try to make the right decisions at the right times, and we only can see as far as we can, and yet our decisions do have consequences. David feels remorse at the end of his life for what some of his decisions created. I think that we all, as we come towards the end of our own lives, if we are so blessed to be able to live a long life and we have this time for reflection, I think many of us will have things that we think about that will bring remorse. So for me, yeah, I can see why David was beloved by God, and I can see why even now he's a beloved character in the Bible. He's flawed, but he does keep trying to do and be the best that he can. So that is week 13. I hope you continue reading 1st and 2nd Samuel. It is a lot to take in, but I also think it's a really good reading time in our Bible. So I hope you're enjoying it. And as always, be sure to let me know if you have any questions. Blessings and peace to you all.